Good evening, everyone. How are we all this evening? Good. So, we've had our question of the evening, and I think really the whole reason I wanted to put this question up was just to get you guys thinking about the topic of how much Christianity is woven into our society. So over the past few months, we've been looking at The Air We Breathe by Glenn Scrivener. Looking at how different values in our society, such as equality, compassion, our right to freedom, and many others, all point back to Jesus. I have no doubt that if you stopped someone in the street and said, "Excuse me, mate, I was just wondering if you thought that equality was a good value," 10 out of 10 times they'd say yes. I mean, if they said no, I think we'd probably question kind of what their values were and what they were really holding dear to them. And so, moving on to our first sort of discussion question for the night. If the values considered good by society come from Christianity, does that mean that Christianity is true? So we're just going to give this 5 minutes, and this is going to be a sort of the style of tonight. We're going to be looking at different sort of small sections, and then we're going to be going on discussing the small sections and working it through, instead of, so you don't have to all sit there and listen to me talk at you for 30 minutes. So yeah. Right, so before Tim talks all evening, I'm kidding, Tim, I'm kidding. So, does that mean that Christianity is true? It's a fairly big question. And I guess, I'm going to read this bit quite carefully. I think the answer genuinely is no, in the sense that it's not the main reason for it being true. It is a point of evidence that leads towards Jesus. But even if the correlation equals causation in this case, as we've been looking at over these past few weeks, the fact that Western culture's morals and values come from Christianity, it still doesn't necessarily mean that Christianity is true. So if you're feeling up for it, which I assume you all are because you're all here, and you don't really have a choice now, let's take a deeper dive into what I'm going to refer to throughout the night as sort of the Jesus story. So this is Jesus' life, his death, and perhaps even his resurrection. So, not yet, sorry. We're sort of faced with an impossible choice. So Jordan Peterson, who's, I'm sure many of you have heard of him. He's a Canadian psychologist who in the recent sort of 5 or 10 years has become quite famous for his views on politics and sociological matters. He said, "I've got the choice of believing two things. I can either believe that the world is constituted so that God took on flesh and was crucified and rose 3 days later, or I can believe that human beings invented this unbelievably preposterous story that has stretched into every atom of culture. And it isn't obvious to me that the second hypothesis is any easier to believe than the first, because the more you investigate the manifestations of the story of Christ, the more insanely complicated and far-reaching it becomes." So he said that back in one of his podcasts in 2021. And the key realization that he proposes is that both the Christian view and the secular view are actually faith positions. Because out of those truths, a Christian believes the first truth, that being that God took on flesh and was crucified and rose again 3 days later. But the secularists are left with the second, that somehow human beings invented this, ridiculous story that is, spread throughout culture. It's the foundation of our Western culture. And we must remember as well that the second impossible truth, that the sort of, when I say secularists, I would mean sort of non-Christians, maybe more agnostics or atheists. The second truth has already happened. A man on a cross has made our Western world. Jesus did die, we know that for a fact, and that has led to the society that we have now, one way or another. And so those people who would oppose this, they can't explain it. There's no rational explanation for that. But the Christian, well, they can just say, well, that man was God himself in the flesh. So that sort of begs our next question. What was so different about Jesus' life that meant that our entire moral culture is based off his teachings? That's quite a big question, so take your time with it and dig into it. So we kind of looked at some different themes, probably in your groups, sort of about Jesus' life, about how radical he was, maybe about how influential he was, or how compassionate he was. So Jesus may have been an extraordinary man, but actually, let's just take a step back and just consider the argument that, you know what, maybe he was just a really nice guy. You know, he was just a pretty nice dude, and he was sort of just strolling around and just being like, you know what, these people need help. I'm just going to give them a bit of help. And so, following on from that, and to sort of counter-argue against that, I want to highlight two aspects of Jesus' story. So the first being that he fulfilled predictions, which we kind of looked at in our group a little bit, and the second, that he defied expectations. When we take a closer look at the Old Testament, so that's the first bit of the Bible, written several hundred years before Jesus was even born, we can see the character of the Messiah. So this is the anointed one. That's what that translates to from Hebrew. And this figure of this Messiah or king or anointed one, a savior figure, is predicted with this startling clarity, beauty, and unity. So let's take a quick look at Genesis 3:15. So we've just had the fall. This is right at the start of the Bible. And God is saying, he's saying to the snake, he's saying, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. So we've already got this figure who is clearly going to come, and he's going to fight the snake, the deceiver, the person who's brought evil into the world, all of sin into the world because of this, singular being, Satan. And we've got this person who's going to come along, and he's going to, defeat him. But that's not going to happen without some form of suffering. We can clearly see, you will strike his heel. So this is going to be, it's going to be defeating evil through suffering. Fast forward through Genesis, we're now at Abraham. So this is probably another couple of hundred years on. And we meet Abraham, who's the father of the Jewish nation and the Islamic nation and eventually the Christian nation or Christian religion. And we meet his son Isaac and his son Jacob. And Jacob fathers 12 sons. And these are the 12 tribes of Israel. And by the end of the book, we hear this prophecy about one of his sons, Judah. Genesis 49, verse 10 reads, the scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he to whom it belongs shall come, and the obedience of the nations shall be his. So Judah is Israel's royal tribe, and the Old Testament, it chronicles literally 1 Chronicles and 2 Chronicles, and all the way through the tales of the kings of Israel. And the kings go on for literally hundreds of years. So they're still only a seat warmer for this Messiah, though. None of them are the actual Messiah. None of them will be that person to raise Israel up to its to glory. And we can know a bit more about this Messiah from the prophets as well. So as we were talking about earlier, we have it predicted, Isaiah 9, 6-7. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. He will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing it and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. So this is a prediction that we're going to have a government, a kingdom, an empire that will rise up and will literally go on forever. The Israelites knew that empires rise and fall. They had suffered under the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, and eventually the Romans. But while these empires have all fallen, Christianity, that would be Jesus' movement, or some might call it his empire, it's often referred to as the kingdom of heaven, that is continued to grow even after his death and supposed resurrection. If you want to read more about the Old Testament prophecies, I really recommend you take a look at the book of Daniel. Daniel chapter 7 in particular really goes into this, but I do recommend you read it with a commentary because it's very poetic and picturesque. Daniel had a vision that there would be 4 empires, which are supposedly the 4 that I've just listed, and that the Messiah would come during the time of the 4th. And interestingly enough, this Messiah is referred to as the Son of Man, and that is one of the main titles that Jesus uses that he refers to himself by throughout the New Testament and throughout his time preaching. And so it's no surprise really that in the 1st century, Israel is under the rule of the 4th Empire and what would be described as sort of messianic fever. So that sort of expectation and eagerness for, this person's going to come. This person, this Messiah, he's going to come. He's going to fight for us. He's going to overthrow the Romans. He's going to, reinstall the kingdom of Israel back in the days, the good old days of, David and Solomon when we were rich and we all had palaces and stuff like that. And so our next question as well, from the prophecies we've looked at, what do you think the Messiah should have been like? I think we've had some great conversations there. I think we've been talking in our group about how we would be looking at this warrior king coming with blazing glory, sort of God himself. I don't know if I mentioned this, but back in that prophecy from Isaiah, the very last line of it, the zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. So God himself is going to do it. And so when a 30-year-old carpenter started teaching, about God, I don't think anyone was really thinking, oh yeah, that's the Messiah, that's him, that carpenter. And it's like, but not even that, because we know him. Oh, that's Jesus, that's Joseph's son. Like, we know what he's like. I watched him grow up, he's not the Messiah. Like, come on. And yet Jesus teaches as if his words were eternally authoritative, his judgment everlastingly decisive. And now we're going to look at the predictions that Jesus made about himself. And I think this is really quite an important thing, because it's all right looking at the Old Testament predictions and saying, oh, what did people think he was going to be like? But what did Jesus actually think about himself? And there were 2 main things that Jesus really highlighted. One, that he would die a violent death. He says this many times throughout the New Testament, that he is going to die. But he also predicts that his movement would continuously grow. We know for certain that he died a violent death. There are many records about the crucifixion of Jesus. I'm not going to go into the specifics of that because it is rather gruesome, and it would have been like torture. Well, it would have been torture. It was designed that way. But Christianity as well, it's still going. It's the largest religion in the world. I think a lot of people would identify themselves as a Christian. And so Jesus' predictions about himself and about his movement have come true. And the crux of the Jesus story is the resurrection. The Gospels in the Bible, so that's the written accounts of Jesus' life, claim that Jesus rose from the dead after 3 days. In fact, the entire Christian faith is founded on this singular claim, that being that Jesus came back to life after he died, which is fairly radical. I mean, I don't think we know anyone personally who's come back to life after they're dead. And I think that would certainly be a bit strange to, oh, well, my granddad just died. Oh, but there he is at the back of church, good old granddad Peter, doing his thumbs up. That was my granddad. That might almost even be a bit terrifying. To see your granddad at the back of church. I saw you die. That would hit you fairly hard. And so, in that moment on the cross, where we have the Bible claiming that the sin of the entire world being laid on one person who also claimed himself to be God, he states that and he answers to that throughout the New Testament. And we're seeing these Old Testament prophecies being fulfilled. And that certainly defied expectations. And so there's one more question that we're going to go through. Not in groups, but just something that we have to consider, which is that, was Jesus' story made up? That's always an excellent question to ask. What proof do we have? What evidence do we have? How accurate are the Gospels? Because, what if the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, and all the other gospels, what if they just took the historical Jesus, who is this, pretty decent guy, not like Superman, super buff and stuff, but maybe just like really kind and compassionate. And what if they just wove him together with Old Testament prophecy to create that incredible story that would forever change our world and lead us to where we are now? And I think the book itself highlights this particularly well. So imagine the writer's room as someone commissions the author of the Gospels. Okay, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, I have a job for you. I know you've had no training or prior experience, but we need you to write the most influential works in literature. As for the timing, we'll have to move on this, unfortunately. It would have been better to wait a couple of centuries before inventing our legends. That way none of Christ's contemporaries could contradict our story. But we are where we are. The Apostle Paul has forced the pace, writing his letters to churches around the Mediterranean. He's been preaching Jesus as the promised Messiah, and heaven knows why, but all these people have believed in God on a cross. The story seems to be working, so now we need you to fill in the details. Please can you write the origin story for our hero? Paul's letters gave the bare bones. We want you to put warm flesh on them. Are you up to it? It won't be easy. We need this to be the life and times of the greatest figure in human history. God, but also man, sinless but fully alive, pure but with profound depths, the judge of the world, but with bottomless compassion, the fulfillment of all Jewish hopes, but with a global appeal, a man in time, but a man for all times. We need a hero with heart-melting kindness, yet steely determination. We need him blasting the self-righteous and befriending sinners. We need sublime ethical teaching to fall from his lips, the kind that builds civilizations. We need extraordinary miracles from him, the kind that would have been noticed and could therefore be contradicted by the generation to which you're writing. We need a credible narrative arc where he remains impeccably righteous, but is nonetheless condemned as a blasphemer. And we need it all to stand up to scrutiny, scriptural, theological, geographical, linguistic, literary, and historical. It needs to be believable both near and far, now and later, for those who live through these times and for all generations to come. Got it? Now, get to work. That is rather difficult to believe. And that is why people like Jordan Peterson find it so difficult to believe that humans simply invented this story, because it's impossible. I mean, I couldn't do it. I don't think anyone I know could do it. And so, when we read the Gospels, we ask, along with Bible scholar Peter Williams, which genius comes up with this? And so now I want to just talk in your groups for a few minutes and consider two questions, which I think these are excellent questions to always consider. Could the Gospels have been genuinely fabricated? And how likely do you think it is that they're genuinely true? And I don't mean sort of in the sense of like, oh, they're edited, slightly, or they're rough accounts of Jesus' life. I mean like that they are literally true, word for word. So we've looked at that question. Could the Gospels have been genuinely fabricated? How likely do you think it is that they're genuinely true? I think it's always a good sort of topic to consider to reinforce your own faith, but also there's that verse in 1 Peter 3:15, I think, where it says, always be ready with an answer for any question that anyone asks you. And so it's good to consider these more difficult topics where actually, we might not have even considered them ourselves. Or maybe you've looked at it in great depth. I'm not sure. So let's take a quick step back and just kind of review where we've been so far. So we've had the prediction and the victory of the victim from the Old Testament, and we've had the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So let's go straight to the end of the story. We're going to talk about Revelation. So a little bit of context. Revelation was a vision given to the Apostle John on the island of Patmos in the Aegean Sea. He had been exiled there by the Roman Emperor Domitian, thank you, Tim, for his Christian faith. And part of John's vision is this, Revelation 5:6. Then I saw a lamb, looking as if it had been slain, standing at the center of the throne. And we get this incredible prediction of what biblical scholars refer to as the kingdom now and yet to come. So this is jumping to Revelation 7:16 to 17. Never again will they hunger, Never again will they thirst. The sun will not beat down on them, nor any scorching heat. For the Lamb at the center of the throne will be their shepherd. He will lead them to springs of living water, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. And we see Jesus describes himself as the good shepherd, and he also describes himself as having, I think it's when he talks to the woman by the well, he says, you will drink living water and you will never be thirsty again. And so the reason that Jesus' resurrection is the crux of the Christian story is because it explains the aftermath. That is 2,000 years of history. It explains how the cross, originally a symbol of execution, becomes a symbol of hope and healing. I mean, imagine if we all started wearing miniature electric chairs or nooses around our necks, and when someone asks us why we're wearing this miniature version of something used to kill and execute people, you say, no, it's supposed to represent life. Like, that just doesn't make sense. It's ridiculous. And yet Jesus has managed it. Triumph through sacrifice. But most important, it explains how the one man most famous for his death has become the one man most encountered by billions as the one most fully alive. And if you're willing to accept Jesus' story as true, then you're left with the consequences. Not a set of rules designed to restrict you from a religion, but a relationship destined to empower you. And the truths of Christianity are incredible. That the world is loved and loved to death. That such love is the very essence of who God is. That behind the history you witness is a history maker who can be trusted. That above all the values you prize is a person who embodies them. That beneath the values you violate is the mercy to forgive you. And that beyond the death you must die is the life he has pioneered, resurrection. And so we get to the reason for the title of this chapter, Choose Your Own Miracle. We each have to choose what we're going to do once we understand Jesus' story, the life, death, and resurrection, and the predictions about him and the future prophecies as well. And so our final question for tonight, before we move on to the Q&A, is who was Jesus, and what does Jesus' story mean for you, or mean for me? I think I've written up there. So that kind of concludes the talk for this evening, at least the talking part. So now we've got the Slido with the questions on it. If you have any questions, chuck them up. Sort of while you're just getting that up, I do want to say this is our last Café Theology for this year. So this has been a sort of a conclusion to a series. Not forever. If you have any topics you think would be good to discuss for next year, either message Jamie or message myself or Gracie. Maybe you'd like to look at, what actually happened to Jesus medically when he was on the cross? Or, what does the Bible say about this topic? And we can kind of look deeper into some of those topics. Stuff that you wouldn't really expect to hear on a Sunday morning preach, but actually that you still think are relevant and just interesting to look at.
That's not for me. I was going to ask another question.
You put that, Jamie, didn't you?
Yeah, I did that.
Yeah, you did. What's the... That's what the code is. So. What's that, you, Gracie?
Is that for me or Caleb?
I didn't write that, I promise.
We got any appropriate? Are there any appropriate questions? Of course, go on, Peter.
Was Jesus a heretic?
Well, he would have obviously been considered that, wouldn't he? Because he was very much moving against the religious establishment of the day, wasn't he? But inherently, if you're God, you can't be a heretic, can you? So he may well have been considered one, but of course he wasn't.
I think the Jews would probably have considered him more like a blasphemer. I think he's quite often referred to as that by the Pharisees. And I mean, when you're going around saying, I am the Son of Man, I am he, before Abraham was, I am. There's something else that's funny.
What's your favourite Christian song?
These are quite outrageous statements. It'd be like, me suddenly going around saying, oh, I am Jesus. You should all worship me and follow me. And it's like, well, are you though? And in some cases, for me, you'd say no, of course, because I'm not Jesus. But for Jesus, well, he was Jesus. So it's sort of a bit different. Yes. What's your favourite Christian song?
I don't know.
Last Christmas by Wham.
That's
Christian song.
It's about Jesus. No, I'm joking.
I'm not sure. Well, we can answer that if you can think of an answer. I find it quite hard to think of an answer, to be honest.
No.
Yeah, I mean that's a
Gratitude.
a tune. But I'd probably go for something older, really, like a bit of a, I don't know.
How great
Yeah,
thou
Big
art.
Down My
Great
Vision.
thou art.
I wouldn't go for that.
Even older.
Come Thou Fount, just love that. When I Survey, it'd be something like that. That's one we've got. We do it. Yeah, man, I love that. It's what a tune.
I quite like older hymns that you can sort of sing with a lot of gusto and heart. And, I call them like belters,
A belter.
Yeah.
Well, if we haven't got any other questions, maybe we should. Oh, go on, Tim. You just say
Go for it, Tim.
What's your favourite piece of... So to speak, you talked a lot tonight about like the sort of evidence for the sort of way gesture of that. But going back to like this whole kind of worldview and culture thing, what is your favourite aspect of Western cultural worldview that like you think is the strongest evidence of Christianity, or like which resonates with you the most strongly?
Forgiveness. That's a very direct answer. But I think I just don't think it's, obvious that you should forgive someone. I mean, it's not like in our nature, I think, to be forgiving. If somebody wrongs you or hurts you, you want to hurt them back. You really do. And that hurt sort of multiplies, and you end up with this, or you call it like a cycle of hatred, where people are just like, oh, I hate you because you hate me, because my dad hated you, because your dad hated my dad. And suddenly you've got, this cycle of hatred going back literally like generations, all because, some bloke somewhere didn't do anything, or he did something that wasn't very nice. So forgiveness, I would sort of say, is the main core value. And I think that's, yeah.
That's not in secular society. I thought Tim was asking what.
Sorry. I think that's a really that is what I was trying to ask. That answer is the thing I was looking for in my question.
Oh, okay.
So I think you're right that it's sort of is still there, but also isn't. I think until recently we would have valued forgiveness in our cultural society, and I think we're drifting away from that. But
now we are, yeah. I wouldn't say that. I personally think that there's a lack of forgiveness in secular society.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I think it's really interesting, because I think if you look in the Bible, our forgiveness of other people is rooted in the fact that God's forgiven us, and it's kind of like the justice you get on the cross means that we can forgive other people, because we don't have to pursue justice ourselves, because Jesus deals with it. And now that we've lost that in secular society, they've not got the cross. Actually, you're seeing the idea of forgiveness is starting to unravel, and you kind of get cancel culture. It's like, well, yeah, where is the justice? If you don't pursue justice and you don't have justice on the cross through Jesus, then like forgiveness just doesn't make sense anymore.
I think justice and forgiveness obviously are conflicted out massively. You understand like man's justice and spiritual justice. Man's justice and spiritual justice are definitely conflicting. Exactly.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true. Yeah, sad but true, isn't it? Yeah.
We have got an extra question. Jamie, without all of the miracles documented, how strong is Jesus' case of being the Messiah?
It's quite a hard question, isn't it? Because actually it's quite difficult to unpick what is miraculous from the life of Jesus, because pretty much everything about his life was miraculous in some way, shape or form, including all of those fulfillments of Old Testament prophecies, including the stuff that was outside of his control, like being born in Bethlehem in a stable, and all the people that came to visit him when he was born. All those kinds of things are all, in a sense, fairly miraculous, or maybe they are kind of ordinary. Depends where you draw the line, really, I guess, of what you would call a miracle, and what you wouldn't. So and then it becomes difficult to imagine. Well, what would his life actually be if all of that stuff was sort of removed in the first place? So I don't know. I find it quite a difficult question to answer, to be perfectly honest, in many ways. I mean, I think by far the strongest thing would be the resurrection, wouldn't it? We would point to saying, well, that's...
I mean, excluding that as a miracle.
Yeah.
I think really, probably just his day-to-day life, I think, or how he treated other people. I wouldn't necessarily consider treating other people, with compassion and sort of equality and encouraging and uplifting people. That's not particularly miraculous in the sense of, like, you're not healing people of leprosy, but the way that he viewed people and the way that he was willing, there's lots of occasions in the New Testament where he says he'd gone off to pray, or he'd gone out, but he saw that the crowds were following with them, and he took great compassion on them, for they were like a flock of sheep without their shepherd. Yeah.
Would the prophecies count as a miracle? The fact that he fulfilled so many prophecies from the Old Testament. So I suppose that wasn't a miracle that he performed himself. But was it a miracle that was?
Yeah, I suppose that's kind of what... Yeah, I think that's what I'm kind of saying, really, because, you think, well, actually, it's pretty miraculous that he fulfilled all those prophecies. Although some of it's quite ordinary things, like where you're born. Like, that's, you might say, well, that's not a miracle. But it kind of is when it's, fulfilling a prophecy, and it's obviously outside of your... no one gets to choose where they're born, do they? So it kind of happened. I
think some of the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies would also have been maybe dependent on how educated Jesus was. I mean, if he had studied the Old Testament scriptures and the prophecies and had known that, this is going to be, this guy will call himself the Son of Man, then he might have done that. So this is sort of just a counter argument in general, but like he could have been like, okay, I'll refer to myself as like the Son of Man then, because then people will know that means that I'm trying to be the Messiah. But I forgot where I was going with this.
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean... Yeah.
There's some stuff you can fake, isn't there?
There's some stuff you can fake.
There's other things you can't
really
fake.
Can't.
Like being poked in the side with a spear when you're on the cross. That was one of the prophecies, wasn't it? They would be fulfilled. Or not having his legs broken. That was another prophecy. Like that's outside of your control, isn't it? He couldn't have orchestrated that.
Or being directly descended from David. We have a list of Jesus's like heritage of his family tree, basically all the way back through David, back to Adam. And so it's very easy to say, well, here we go, we can trace his family line. So there's some stuff that that's completely out of his control. So
yeah.
And like not even the specific prophecies being filled, but even like when you're looking at like the story of Joseph or like Daniel, what you were saying, so many mirrors between those stories. Not even like the prophecies that say this will be Jesus, this is the Messiah, but even just the stories in the Old Testament are so similar, or like tell a similar story to Jesus. There's so many similarities in Jesus.
Good. I think we should end there with one final song.